So I think the main takeaway is that if you are providing sensory activities to your clients, like you're a therapist, you're providing these sensory activities to your clients and they're not working when you feel like they should be working because that's what the child is seeking out or that's what they need to feel regulated, but they're just not working, look and see, okay, is it because it's a passive sensory activity? What can I do to change it into an active sensory activity that they can participate in with their entire body and see if it makes a difference?
I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica, and this is All Things Sensory by Harkla.
We are both certified occupational therapy assistants, and together with Harkla, we are on a mission to empower parents, therapists, and educators to help raise confident and strong children of all abilities.
On this podcast, we chat about all things sensory, diving into special needs, occupational therapy, parenting, self-care, overall health and wellness, and so much more.
We are here to provide raw, honest, and fun strategies, ideas, and information for parents, therapists, and educators, as well as other professionals to implement into daily life.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, welcome to All Things Sensory by Harkla. We're so happy to have you here today. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica. And today we're going to talk about the difference between passive and active sensory activities.
This is a new topic for us. It's
finally.
I mean, it's still sensory, but it is a new topic because I was taking this course. It's called The Sensory Chef. And it's by Julia Harper. She is hilarious, by the way. I highly recommend. I was cracking up the whole time. I want to go to one of her in-person trainings because she's just so funny. But it was great. And she was talking a lot about active versus passive proprioceptive input. And I was like, oh my gosh, we never talk about this.
Well, and it was funny too, because around the same time, I had this like light bulb moment working in the clinic of like why some of the sensory strategies we were talking about for a client I'm working with, why they weren't working. Mm-hmm. And I realized it was because they were passive sensory activities. They were sensory activities that the parent was doing like to or for the child versus the child engaging in the activities with their body, right?
Yes.
And I feel like we had that realization kind of around the same time.
Moment. We're like, we need to talk about this.
Yeah. And ever since then, I've been telling all of my clients' families about it. Like just the other day was talking about vestibular input and how the client I was working with became very overstimulated with rotary vestibular input, like passive. The child was sitting in my lap while we were spinning and the child became overstimulated. But I was talking to the parent, we've seen this child engage actively in rotary vestibular input and the child doesn't become overstimulated. I was like, there's such a huge difference here. We need to talk about it. Also, we've talked about this in regards to primitive reflexes and the difference between passive primitive reflex exercises and active primitive reflex exercises, which we should probably talk about on our YouTube channel because that's where we talk about all things primitive reflexes now.
Yeah.
But
today it's sensory. So what does a passive sensory activity look like? Basically, it means that they are not controlling the movement. They are not doing the movement. The movement is being done to them, or the input is being provided to them. Mm-hmm. So you think about, we're going to talk about some examples, but just a quick example of, you think about in the chair, right? Jessica was in the chair with the child, spinning the child. The child was not in control of that movement, was not up on their feet.
It's like there was no brain-body connection.
Yes.
Is the way I think of it.
This input is happening to them rather than they are doing this movement. Whereas an active sensory activity is like they are standing up and spinning, where they're actually getting some proprioceptive input from that one because their feet are on the ground.
Yeah.
So
thinking some other examples of passive sensory activities would be you providing the deep pressure by doing the steamroller on the child, or you providing the vibration because you're the one holding the vibrating tool.
Yeah.
Or you are providing the joint compressions or the traction to the child.
Yes.
And we're not saying that these passive sensory activities are bad
No.
or ineffective. We're saying they're different.
Just a different way of getting the input. And we're going to talk about this at the end. The length that this input lasts will vary if you're doing an active activity or a passive activity. So if it's an active vestibular input, then it's going to last so much longer than passive, and so forth. And we'll break down what those like guidelines are at the end and what you can expect. But from an active sensory activity, an example could be they are completing an animal walk versus, like Jessica mentioned, being steamrolled, right? So they are doing the movement, they are motor planning, they are getting that heavy work input to them, and they are doing that activity, or they're completing the monkey bars or a straight arm hang, and they are holding onto the bar and hanging.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great.
Yeah.
Love that.
There's a ton of other examples I'm sure that we could talk about, but I feel like that paints the picture fairly well.
Paints that picture.
Because we're the painters.
No one's going to understand that.
An inside joke with our team. So when you are providing the child with the sensory input, it's passive sensory, they're still getting a lot of benefits, right? So we're not saying that the passive sensory activities are bad. They're still great, and we don't want to take them away. But if you're noticing that you're doing the steamroller with your child, and you think, all right, Rachel and Jessica said the steamroller is a really great proprioceptive deep touch pressure activity. It should help my child feel calm. I've already met their sensory threshold. Now we're doing the steamroller, but it's not working. It's not helping them feel calm and regulated. Okay, well then let's try something else that's similar, but it's an active sensory activity, something that they are doing the deep pressure, they are getting it themselves, and they're having that like brain body connection, and let's see if that makes a difference.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it.
Yeah. So going back to Jessica's example, when she was spinning the child in the chair with her and the child was getting very dysregulated versus when the child was spinning on their own, we are not seeing that same dysregulation. That's what we want you to understand too, is that the varying types of ways that we can give this input, or they can get this input, it will have a different impact on the response. And so I think that's why we really wanted to talk about this episode. Why we wanted to talk about this today in this episode is because maybe if you're a therapist and you're stuck and you are trying to give this child maybe some proprioceptive input, you're doing traction or you're doing joint compressions or steamrolling, and you're like, this child is just not getting organized. Like, what is happening? Then we can try maybe swapping it for more active proprioception. They can pull themselves up the slide with a rope, or they can crawl through a tunnel, or they can crawl under a crash pad, and we can change the type of input that we're giving them, even though it's still maybe proprioceptive input or tactile or vestibular input. It's still the same input, but they are in charge of it, and they are having that brain body connection on their own versus having someone else do it to them. So it's just a mindset shift.
Mm-hmm. Now, I just thought of this question. Do you think that for you, do you think that wearing a weighted vest is active or passive sensory input?
Ooh. Okay, let's break it down.
Okay.
So we put the vest on the child.
Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself would make you think that it is a passive activity. Mm-hmm. But the child then has to hold their body up against gravity with this extra weight, which is more of an active. Can we call a friend? Can we call Julia on this one? Julia, what's up?
Maybe it's both.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But I'm going to lean more towards the passive side.
That's what I was thinking as well.
Because it's just like, we don't want them to wear a weighted vest more than 20 minutes at a time, because their body won't have that adaptive response on its own. It won't learn to modulate, versus I guess we're not going to be like crawling for 20 minutes necessarily.
No,
but
I think the way I thought of it was that there is a little bit, because it, like you said, it is a little bit of extra weight for their body to hold up against gravity, but they're definitely not activating their muscles in the same way that they are with an animal walk.
Yeah.
So I would also lean more towards passive, but it could be looked at in both ways.
Like a 75-25, 75% passive.
35?
25%. Good
Wow, math is so hard.
Quarters, baby, it's quarters. 25% active. That's my guess.
Okay.
I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on that too.
Yeah.
Because it might be all passive, but I just feel like, especially if maybe you're doing movement activities with a weighted vest on top of it, then it's even more input. But I think about, weighted ankle weights or wrist weights. Yes, it's a passive thing that we're putting on the child, but it just provides more feedback. Mm-hmm. And it takes more activation to move against gravity.
Yeah, it does. Especially the ankle weights. I love the ankle weights.
I do too. Yeah.
And those aren't necessarily activities, I guess. Those are more like tools and strategies.
Yeah.
Whereas we're talking more of like activities because there is a difference. But anyways.
We're deep down the rabbit hole right now.
I think the main takeaway here, we're going to give you some ideas next, but I think the main takeaway is that if you are providing sensory activities to your clients, like you're a therapist, you're providing these sensory activities to your clients and they're not working when you feel like they should be working because that's what the child is seeking out or that's what they need to feel regulated, but they're just not working, look and see, okay, is it because it's a passive sensory activity? What can I do to change it into an active sensory activity that they can participate in with their entire body and see if it makes a difference?
Really quick, we need to let you know about our biggest sale of the year. Our early bird Black Friday sale starts on November 11th. During this sale, you will receive a free gift with your purchase. The catch here is that you need to sign up now in order to get access to this early bird sale. Go to harkla.co/early to get signed up, and then you can start shopping and saving on November 11th.
All right, so let's jump into just our quick activities. We're going to start with our favorite passive activities that we're going to do with our sensory, not necessarily our sensory seekers, sensory voiders, sensory kids, anyone in general. We're going to do blanket swinging. So putting the child into a blanket and swinging them and then maybe crashing them on the couch or the beanbag or the crash pad. That's a great one to start with.
We already mentioned it, but steamroller is a really great passive sensory activity. So the child lays on the floor on their stomach and you use a large ball to roll over their body, provide some deep touch pressure, change the pressure depending on if the child wants more or less. We typically avoid the upper chest area and the head unless the child asks for it, but that can be a really great deep touch pressure activity.
Yep. And then the brushing protocol or deep pressure brushing, grabbing one of those surgical brushes or a dry brush, brushing the child's body, arms, back, arm, leg. I've heard too, some people say brush the chest, brush the tummy. Some people say don't brush the chest, don't brush the tummy.
I think it depends on the child. If you're following the specific protocol, the protocol says not to. But if the child wants it and it makes them feel good.
Karen Pryor says brush it because then you'll have this, lack of awareness in the trunk. And if we're trying to build the awareness, it depends really what the goal is. So that's neither here nor there, but just food for thought for you.
The next one is joint compression. So this is where you're, placing your hands, like sandwiching the child's joints, the elbows, wrists, knees, ankles, shoulders, hips, and providing some neck.
Or just head, shoulders, knees, and toes.
Gentle compression to the joints to provide some of that joint compression. Going along with that, traction pulls.
I love these. If I could hire someone to just pull me all day long, I would.
So you need 3 people for this one. So your child's going to lay on the floor on their back. You're going to have one person holding their hands, another person holding their feet, and you're just going to gently pull, very gently. This is not pull really hard, especially a child. They're small. They don't need a lot. So just very gentle.
Or if they're hypermobile, you also want to be very careful as well.
Yes.
And you can also push together too. So pulling and pushing, that's a great one. I absolutely love that. And then the last one, like we mentioned with Jessica, sitting in an office chair or sitting in a chair where they aren't really, they're not doing anything. They're not sitting up. They're just leaning against a chair, spinning them in both directions.
Yeah, there's more. Of course.
Lots more.
This is just our list of our favorite ones.
Yeah.
Okay, our favorite active sensory activities. The first one is the child is maybe laying on their tummy on the swing and using their arms to push themselves off the ground, or using their feet to push themselves around. However they want to position themselves, they are propelling themselves with their arms and or their legs.
Yep. Animal walks, bear walks, crab walks, turkey walks, elephant walks, I said turkey walks, chicken walks, penguin walks,
Wheelbarrow walk.
Yeah. Any kind of animal walk. Let them decide. Cheetah walk, cheetah crawl, cheetah run, backwards crawling, backwards bear crawling.
So good.
Animal walks are great.
Backwards bear walks are so hard.
Yes, they are.
Climbing up slides. This is something I've always encouraged my child to do, my clients to do. When I'm at the park, I'm like, hey, how many of you kids can climb up the slide? Encourage your child to climb up the slides. It's a great motor planning activity. It's an active sensory activity. They're getting a ton of great input.
Make the room bigger. I actually taught my daughter, my 2-year-old, how to do this activity because she was swinging in the Harkla compression swing. Spinning. I'm like, oh, this isn't going to end well. And she gets out of the swing and she's like, I'm kidding. It was so funny. Mama, I'm dizzy. She's going in circles. And I was like, can you make it to the wall and push the wall?
And did she?
She crawls over the wall.
She had to crawl. Oh, no.
She starts pushing. I'm sorry, I'm just replaying it. She gets over and she's pushing the wall, and I was like, you're doing great, sweetie.
Oh, my goodness.
It was so funny. I shouldn't have been like just sitting across from the room watching her, but I didn't want her to think that
It was bad.
it was a bad thing. I was like, yeah, you just spun the shit out of yourself. You should probably go to the wall now.
So you taught her how to make the room bigger?
Yes. So basically, make the room bigger means to push it with your hands, push it with your feet, push it with your back. And we always get really silly and over the top with this one because, they don't want to push the wall. That's a silly thing to do. So like, oh my gosh, it's moving. Did you see that? It actually moved. You moved the wall. And they're like, wait, what? It did. It's really funny. But yeah.
It's a great one.
Anyways, let's just finish this out here. Make the room bigger. Dots and squeezes, squeezing your fingers, squeezing your joints, squeezing each fingertip, squeezing your arms.
And this is the child doing it on themselves.
Yes. Thank you.
Yep. Very important. Otherwise, it's not active.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. A great vestibular active activity would be log rolling. Teaching your child how to log roll across the floor, across the crash pads for an added challenge. When you do log rolling, make sure you log roll both directions. I just thought about somersaulting.
Yeah, I was going to say that too.
Having all my clients somersault. It is a very tricky motor planning activity. So also, if you have not listened to other episodes where we talk about kind of order of operations, anytime we're talking about completing sensory activities, if you're going to do a vestibular activity, make sure you follow it up with proprioception.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk about like how long the active versus the passive input will last. So generally, you have this all written down. Generally, vestibular input lasts 2 to 6 hours.
The active?
Yes, so active input will be 2 to 6 hours. Passive can be 6 to 12 hours.
So the passive vestibular input will last longer
Vestibular wise, yeah.
if it's passive.
Yes.
So for example, the client that I was spinning,
You screwed them for the entire day.
I did talk to the mom and was like, if you notice anything off, this is why. Here's what you can do. So that is good to know because that overstimulation that can be caused from vestibular input will likely last longer if it was passive input versus if it was active
Yeah, because
input.
they're getting some prop when they're doing those active
Yes.
vestibular activities,
Yes, they
which is
are.
what kind of counterbalances it.
Yes. So in general, then, we could say, I mean, we said they're both great, but in general, we could say that active vestibular input might actually be better.
Yes. Unless you're in need of a lot, if you have a really high seeking child who needs a lot of vestibular input in order to regulate, then you could look more at those passive passive ways of getting input. Okay. Proprioception, active can last 2 to 4 hours. Passive can last 90 minutes to 2 hours.
So kind of like the opposite.
Yes.
So active proprioception is going to last longer than passive proprioception.
Because they're doing the work. They're getting the input to their joints.
They're getting the brain-body connection. So that regulation from the proprioception is going to last longer when they are doing it.
Yes.
Which, as I mentioned before, clients who are completing these, like the steamroller, and it's not working, it's not regulating their child, that's a perfect example of why.
Yes.
Okay,
tactile input. Active can last 90 minutes to 2 hours. And just with this one, deep touch pressure is the preferred. So rather than like the light, noxious stimuli, like tickling their back or using that like wire head massager.
Oh gosh, those are so funny.
Using that active, deep pressure is going to be the preferred option.
Because it's also a form of proprioception.
Yes.
Yep.
When it is the deep touch pressure. Yes. Oral input is the most organizing. So adding this to all strategies to increase focus can be beneficial.
Yep.
So you're studying for a test, suck on a hard candy or chew on a high chew or chew on gum. If you are, think about babies trying to go to bed. They want something to suck on, right? They want that organizing input. That's really what it comes down to, is it's organizing for the nervous system. It's nurturing. So providing that during focus work can be very organizing for the nervous system.
Okay, great. Was that it?
I think so.
Awesome.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully you were watching this episode on YouTube. If not, make sure you go to the All Things Sensory YouTube channel, subscribe. If you're watching on Spotify, you can leave us a review, leave us a comment. If you're listening on iTunes, you should go watch us on video.
Yep. Take a screenshot, tag us, All Things Sensory Podcast. Let us know if this episode was helpful, if you learned something new, if you're going to go try some of these strategies, tag us and let us know.
All right. With that,
we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to All Things Sensory by Harkla.
If you want more information on anything mentioned in the show, head over to harkla.co/podcast to get the show notes.
If you have any follow-up questions, the best place to ask those is in the comments on the show notes, or message us on our Instagram account, which is at Harkla_family or at All Things Sensory Podcast. If you just search Harkla, you'll find us there.
Like we mentioned before, our podcast listeners get 10% off their first order at Harkla. Whether it's for one of our digital courses or one of our sensory swings, the discount code SENSORY will get you 10% off. That's SENSORY.
Head to harkla.co/sensory to use that discount code right now.
We are so excited to work together to help create confident kids all over the world. While we make every effort to share correct information, we're still learning.
We will double check all of our facts, but realize that medicine is a constantly changing science and art.
One doctor or therapist may have a different way of doing things from another.
We are simply presenting our views and opinions on how to address common sensory challenges, health-related difficulties, and what we have found to be beneficial that will be as evidence-based as possible.
By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or your child.
Consult your child's pediatrician or therapist for any medical issues that he or she may be having.
This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast.
Thanks so much for listening.